And so in 2018, I had my first sabbatical. When I was doing this research, we came upon a report of alleged state violence against ethnic minority Kazakh residents. So, in northwest China is a distinct region of the country. It includes to the south there the Tarim Basin, which borders Tibet, and then the Dzungar Basin, which comes up between Mongolia and Kazakhstan. The Xinjiang region, traditionally the Xinjiang region, as well as the states of Uzbekistan and southern Kazakhstan, were known in total as an area called Turkestan. And that was because the peoples of these regions spoke Turkic languages. Now, they are different languages, but they are mutually intelligible. And so for a lot of history, it was known as Turkic, the languages that were spoken, and there were really just lots of different dialects and lots of different local variations on Turkic. Today, they're known as different languages. The Chinese state moved in to incorporate what is known as Eastern Turkestan. That is the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. And originally, it was really through protecting trade and through protecting traders, so that traders had a safer kind of route through Turkestan. So they began to expand and form allies, and through diplomacy, develop relations with the city-states that were in the Xinjiang region. By the 300 BC and beyond, there's clearly a Chinese presence in this Xinjiang region. And through history, it sort of expands. Chinese control even went further into Turkestan, as far into eastern Kazakhstan. Later in history, in the final dynasty, the Qing dynasty, were expanded quite a bit further to the west as well. And so this is an important area of contact between, on the one hand, Chinese traders and politicians and so on, the people of eastern Turkestan, and then traders from further west, traders from Kazakhstan, and today's Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, people from the Arab and Persian worlds. You had people from the north, from Siberia and so on, all who've kind of left their mark in this region. So it's in some ways a microcosm of some of the dynamics that played out in the Silk Road as a whole. And if we're thinking in terms of the pre-modern system, that would be true, and it is true for today. So Xinjiang, because it borders these Central Asian states, is a really important area of cross-border trade. You see trade with Russia, and there's a huge Russian population in Xinjiang today. There's trade with Kazakhstan. There's a large Kazakh population. There are border trade set up with Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and a very important trade route in the southwest of Xinjiang with Pakistan and also India. And so this is a really important part of contemporary Chinese discussion of the Silk Road. They're really referring to some of the rail lines and the trading zones and trading centers of the Xinjiang region. And if you're looking at this from the perspective of, let's say, Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan, also one of the important trading partners today would be China. That's why they are all sort of sitting down with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and developing economic policy, developing political policy to kind of grow and develop and to safeguard these forms of trade. So you might have the sense that with the development of the pre-modern world system and then the contemporary modern system, that Eastern Turkestan is very, very developed and very well off, and much of the population is benefiting, right, from this trade. And to some extent that is true. You can see that the impacts of the trade and the kind of international cooperation. But there's also forms of conflict. You have numerous groups that are in this area that are struggling for greater autonomy. So rather than celebrating this kind of integration in China and integration in the new modern world system, there are many groups that are really struggling to kind of detach from these relationships. They are trying to assert greater autonomy and greater independence from China. Some of these groups are struggling for the independence of Eastern Turkestan, for a Muslim Eastern Turkestan. There are groups even that are struggling for a broader Turkestan as a whole. So something that would be very different than any of the independent states that we have today, in which most are colonial relics. They don't follow the same kind of political boundaries as the political units of the pre-modern period. We have political movements that are ethnic based. So the Eastern Turkestan area, the majority ethnic group in that region are known as the Uyghur people. These are a Turkic-speaking ethnic minority in China. They reside both in China, and there's other smaller populations in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and other countries as well, including as far to the west as Europe. And some of the issues that these groups are sort of raising in the contemporary period is that, well, despite all of the development and relations, there's a lot of economic underdevelopment in Xinjiang. There is a high levels of poverty in Xinjiang. There's a great deal of inequality in Xinjiang, both between Uyghur and Uyghur, but between the Uyghur as a whole and the Han Chinese. They are really raising these issues and saying that kind of sovereignty and self-determination for a Uyghur nation may lead to greater development. If the Uyghur had control over some of the trade and politics, that they may have a greater degree of development in the Xinjiang region. And they really make this articulation in strongly nationalist terms. Terms that, because they are a nation, they should be sovereign, they should have a state that represents them as a group of people, and they are developing their nationalism, drawing on things like religion, things like Islam, as well as race, arguing that they're a distinct race. They're distinct from the Chinese. Some Uyghur argue that they are distinct from other Turkic groups as well. Now, there are many different groups that are associated with this kind of political movement, and there are violent extremist groups as well. So Xinjiang has been prone the last few decades to terrorism. It's been prone to terrorism, and it's also been prone to a kind of repressive Chinese state response. And part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, part of its role and function and so on, is also dealing with the threats of these political movements to continue development of international trade and international stability. And that's across border. So that is China working with countries like Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan and so on to both deal with Uyghur political movements, both internal to China, but also to the Uyghur groups that are outside the country, which support, encourage these movements as well.
This area has a really diverse population. There's the Han, the dominant majority of the country, but there are many minorities such as the Uyghur, Kazakh, Mongol, Hui, and so on. There is an institution of political and economic autonomy, so the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, and then within that region, autonomous areas and autonomous counties and so on. But those institutions have failed in many ways, and there is still active separatist movement to break away that region and to form an independent country. So the People's War Against Terrorism is a sort of major policy change that attempts to preempt the separatist movement and to prevent any kind of further violence, to really enforce a particular kind of social order. It's very multifaceted. There are various restrictions on minority rights. There are new forms of police and surveillance. Actually, that's what you see in this picture. And there is a range of mass detention. People that are suspected, they have some sympathies with separatist movements or nationalist kinds of movements. These people are arrested, detained for re-education.
曾经的他们
如果我不来这里学习的话，我会干什么？
发生怎样的转变？
技能也提高很多，思想方面也改变了很多很多。
Here you can see the vocational training of these re-education camps where people are said to be retrained for new kinds of work, and their thoughts are cleaned of separatist and other kinds of nationalist leanings. And the mass detentions have gotten a lot of international press because these are people who are detained in an extra legal manner, many of whom have never committed any crime, but they're removed from their workplace, they're removed from their families, and then they are incarcerated in these re-education camps. And a lot to be said about the kinds of internal conditions of the camps as well. So a lot of allegations of crimes, rapes, violence, torture, and so on in these camps. And then real issues about the release of the detainees back into society. You have reports of people losing their property, right, because when they were detained for a year or two, they were not making payments, let's say, on their house, and their house was taken back by the bank and so on. Lots of these kinds of really complicated issues. We have cases where parents are detained and then their children are brought into the welfare system, and they're placed in sometimes with the Han majority rather than with their own ethnic minority neighbors and so on, family members. So a lot of very complicated problems and issues within the mass detention.
So it has really criminalized many aspects of Islamic practice. This is a Muslim part of northwest China. And it really has come to bring a lot of the state down upon people's everyday cultural practices, particularly with regards to Islam and to any kind of Muslim practice. And the allegation was that in one town in northwest China, we had an episode or an event of state violence when Kazakh residents were told not to follow Islamic funerary rites. And the community, the group, followed through with the rites. And in the police action against that, to break that funeral up, to control people's behavior, they did open fire on the residents, and a number of people lost their lives. That was the allegation. And this has not been reported in Chinese media, as far as I'm aware. And so I've decided for my next project that I'm going to be looking into this particular allegation. For this particular course, we are going to use the allegation as a case study. This 2019 allegation of state violence against ethnic minority Kazakh Muslims in northwest China. We're going to look at this from a four-field approach. We're going to draw on all of the resources of anthropology to design a project that will be able to answer this question of what happened in that region. What happened at Town E? This is precisely the question that we're going to be looking at over the course of this quarter. And the idea of method here begins from the notion that we don't know the answer to what happened at Town E. We have an allegation. We have a group of ethnic Kazakhs whose relatives underwent this violence. And on the basis of that knowledge, they communicated that to me. So the idea of method is important here. If we just simply know what happened, there's no really question of methods then. I mean, I could be a political advocate and on the basis of what I was told, advocate for that community. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I think that's actually a really good thing, something that's important for us to do. But if we're going to think about the production of knowledge, we're going to think about how we do research in anthropology, how we inquire about the world, well, we can't just take it at face value. That at Townie, there was this state violence against the local population. We need to find out for ourselves what actually happened. And this is precisely the idea of a method, that there has to be a way to ascertain the truth. Now that's questionable and in some circles very controversial. But I think, reflecting on the idea of method here is very important. We are really dealing with epistemological questions about how we know what we know. And for methods, it's really the question of what do we need to know? What are the particular observations? What is the data? What is the evidence that we need to know to have a strong answer to this question, answer that we can have confidence in? How can we go through these materials and sources to understand really what happened there in Northwest China? And it really does exist on this basis of skepticism. So even though there's the report, we need to find a way, we need to find a method, right, to know what happened with more certainty. Not that it will be completely certain, which is really not quite reflective of the way knowledge production works. There's never 100% certainty, but more certainty, let's say, than we would have now. So now you've all heard it from me that there was this allegation of state violence against the residents, but you only know that from my testimony. And so that's a kind of a weaker form of knowledge. If we can explore methods, we can explore ways of knowing, we can explore ways to gain certain kinds of new observations, new data and evidence, well, we may be able to have a stronger answer to this question. Our knowledge might be more certain rather than less certain. And we're going to draw upon the conventions of our discipline. So our discipline would argue, even before we pose this question, right, something about what we need to know if we want to understand human behavior, right? We need language about it. We need what has been said about this particular event. We need information and evidence about the site of the event and the material culture of the event. And we need the human bodies and remains. We need to be able to access, at a minimum, if you will, these three kinds of data streams to develop a very strong argument for what happened. An argument that doesn't depend on one particular method or one particular anthropologist, but which can be triangulated right against several different methods and several different anthropologists.